Hello and welcome to Consolation League, a Warhammer podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Scott.
And I'm Paul.
And today we are joined by a really fantastic player, a really great guy, somebody who I got the opportunity to play against, get thoroughly beaten by, and get some great advice at the Toronto Fall Open. Nick Blackburn, thank you very much for joining us.
Hey fellas, well, thanks for inviting me. It's an honor.
Yeah, and we're lucky enough to get you before you're taken off to Worlds. So hopefully a little bit later on we can talk about that whole process and kind of
Of
how you
course.
prepare for it and everything like that. But I'd love to start off. We were just shooting the breeze before we started recording. And you say you've been playing this for forever and a day. How long is forever and a day? Like what got you into it and in what, I guess, edition did you actually join?
Yeah, it's been like almost a trillion years. But I think my story is kind of very similar to most like guys our age. I won't guess your ages, but I'm getting long in the tooth, man. I'm almost
I'm
40.
longer. Okay.
Yeah. And
I'll give
and
you a
so
hint. I was raking leaves and I'm sore.
yeah, oh yeah, well then you and me cut from the same cloth. Yeah. So I like my first exposure, I remember, and this is vividly. I think I was probably 12 or 13, maybe a bit younger, but I was with my dad, and it was at like a Bayshore shopping center in Ottawa, and there was a Games Workshop store when I mean, there's still some there, but they're not as frequent. Anyways, um, I remember we'd walked in thinking it was video games, like anybody else that walks into a Games Workshop.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And but then you notice the first thing, and they know what they're doing, right? They have the cabinet with the nicely painted models, and you're just this kid with an imagination, and you see this and people playing games, and you're just like your brain explodes. You look over to your dad, and then as your dad starts to notice the prices on everything, I'm sure his face sinks as he realizes what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
Anyways, so that's kind of it. Like I started at that age and played with some friends locally, like, Basement Hammer, Pop Kansas Terrain, and what other models you scrambled together that you finger painted, and you're like probably not even playing the right rules. But anyways, you're enjoying it.
Mhm.
Of course, sometime later, university happens. That's kind of not really your interest anymore. You've got other interests that are competing, whatever else. Fast forward, I don't know, 10 years to when I'm like, I don't know, at this point, maybe 27, 26, maybe closer to 30. I can't remember. But like I'm in grad school and I'm super busy with work, but I found like that's all I'm doing is just focused on work and study. And like my life at that point was literally go to work, come home, watch TV, go to work, come home, watch TV. And I remember at the time, my girlfriend was my wife now. I was like, I don't like that my only leisure is just coming home to watch TV. And I had mentioned to her, I was like, when I was younger, I really enjoyed this. And I don't know what kind of at the time sparked re-interest in it. So I said, I'm gonna go and just go to a store and look at it. And she came with me and we went to a Games Workshop that at that time had moved to near the Coliseum movie theater on Space or wherever it is in Ottawa.
Still
And
there.
it says it's still there.
Yeah.
So we're walking through and she saw my face light up like, oh my God, like this stuff is still cool. Like,
Hmm.
have you worried that, what made it cool when you're a 13-year-old kid isn't going to be cool when you're in your like early 30s
Mhm.
or late 20s? But no, absolutely nothing's changed. And you're like,
Yeah.
okay, just take my money and I'm going to take all of this home.
Yeah.
And that was like Warhammer Fantasy 8th edition. And so I got deep
Okay.
into that. It took like zero time from like and at the time I like the community on Facebook wasn't as prevalent. You're like on these weird forums, Bolter and Chainsword. Anyway, so I found a community, met some friends that I'm still like friends with today. Chris Haynes is actually one of them, met through like Warhammer Fantasy. And yeah, and started playing that. But then of course fantasy died, that whole story.
Yep.
And my friend group, I guess universally just decided that 40K was going to be the jump.
Mhm.
AOS at the time wasn't really that compelling. It was yeah, it was rough. I understand today is like an amazing game,
It's
but at the
awesome.
time it was like 40K was the jump, and we all did that and kind of never looked back. And so just been playing with friends, and then just over the years have been getting playing it more and more competitively. Of course, with grad school, I would join the service, and then we had COVID, so like the competitive component was up and down over the years, right? I
Mhm.
you know, if you're like away for work for 8 months, you miss potentially whole metas,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
But I've since then gotten more of a desk job, right? A government desk job. So like that kind
Nice.
of stabilizes, you will, if the life
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and
Yep.
so
It would.
I do have a little one at home, so that but he's also like getting a bit older. Like he's 5 now. So when he was born and stuff, you know, it's a little bit more challenging. But as he's getting a little bit older and it's easier to handle at home, like, you know, you can
Hmm.
run away for the weekend, the wife can
Yep.
handle him. It's a little bit easier. Yeah, I found the last few years at least have been able to compete, I guess, a bit more consistently, you know, at least stay engaged more consistently with the game. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's
I was
long story to long story. Sorry.
No, that's exactly what we were looking for. That's amazing. Um, One of the things that I was really impressed with when you and I had our game was you were talking about, I guess you've fostered a really great community, or you've got a really great community out there, because the list you ended up bringing was one that was kind of community driven, or like, I guess, like fundraised for, like you did a charity fundraiser for it, and they kind of picked what your list was going to be, and that's what you brought to the Toronto game.
So I have this like propensity to just talk nonsense all of the time. So like for better or worse, like my friends just get bombarded with ADHD nonsense when I'm bored. And so not like I want to go to the Toronto Fall Open because a lot of those guys like Jeff and Keith and Carl, like they make an effort to come to the Ottawa events and stuff like that. So I was like, I wanted to make an effort to go to their event and support them. And I wanted to take it seriously as well. There was also like the meta balance that happened
Hmm.
not too long ago. Like actually, I think the day of list
Yep.
walk or whatever else.
Yeah. Yes.
So I figured like, well, I'm not going to actually have the time. And I was before that, just before that, I was playing Thousand Suns, and I knew like,
Mhm.
okay, they're about to get clapped in the
Yeah.
balance. So I figured like it was an opportunity for me to take a break from just hard grinding it and just being able to go to an event, no expectations or whatever else. So part of the ADHD nonsense I mentioned was at one point in the group chat, I said, I can't decide. Ha ha ha. I'm on the list spiral. And without not realizing, but remembering that I have some friends that don't have mortgages anymore, I said, you know, I wonder if like $200 to the local food bank and somebody, you know, like if we could raise $200 to the local food bank,
Yeah.
you know, then those people could like vote on my army or pick my army. I don't know why I thought $200 maybe was like an amount that was insurmountable, but like immediately my buddies, like just two of them, $700 like to the Ottawa Food Bank, and they're like, they're playing demons. And I'm like, they're like, you forgot we don't have mortgages. I was like, oh, fair enough. Fair enough.
Fair
So,
enough.
Next time, bar will be higher.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I
exactly.
just, why didn't I say 10 grand?
Yeah,
Why
well,
didn't I
that's
say 10
immediately my
grand?
thought, right? And so then I'm like, okay, we're playing demons, and I haven't played my demons since like seventh, or no, that's not true. I played them late ninth when Bellacore was busted. But like since that point in ninth, I hadn't played them. So I'm like digging them out, dusting them out, and like trying to figure out a list for them. And I mean, I played some practice games, but nothing was really like singing to me. Like there was the Crusher list, but nothing I fell in love with other than I'm just gonna play my big monsters that I've painted, like I've lovingly painted, and
Mhm.
are just gonna be. I'm gonna shove them up the field, and either it works out or it doesn't. And
Mhm.
that's pretty much what TFO was. But it was like a fun, yeah. It was a way to kind of like not completely disconnect from the game competitively. Like I still played the game competitively. I still like
Mhm.
Yep.
did what I thought I could with big demons, but I knew we were gonna run into some real difficult matches. Like Thousand Suns was one of them because they could just effortlessly say they're dead. I'm like, oh yeah,
Mhm.
that happens. And other stat checks. But then of course I get big games of them where if I knew what the opponent's army could do, that might struggle into my list or whatever else, like the Votan, right, is
Yep.
one example. But yeah, that's kind of what happened there, and not to like bury the lead a little bit, kind of snowballed into the world champs too. But if you want to talk about that later, we can. But Yeah, that nonsense kind of snowballed to the world champs as well, with more restrictions this time though, because I wasn't going to play big boy demons at the world champs. But yeah,
You didn't want to run the risk of a like $500 food bank bet that turned into you playing Gene Stealers
I mean that
in
wouldn't have been so
Atlanta.
bad because Gene Stealer cult is pretty good right now. No,
Yeah.
so like I had like gone off, not off, well, offline from this chat. I went to and I spoke to Dan. I'm like, hey, because it was so successful, I was like, I wonder if we do something similar for world championships and do like I don't know $2,000, and because these are amounts I didn't think people would be willing, but then it
Hmm.
kind of that snowballed and people started like actually promoting it, and yeah, that jumped to $2,700 in collective
Wow.
donations to
Well done.
but that one, I did limit the choice. It wasn't like complete free reign. Like the other one, I
Hmm.
didn't really care. Like if you could get me the models for TFO, I'll play it. And it just
Hmm.
so happened I had demons. And but for the world champs, I was like, no, I don't want to go there and just get clapped.
Yeah.
For I don't necessarily want to bring like 100 TAC Marines.
Yeah.
And at the same time, like it's busy, life's busy. I don't want to spend the weeks leading up to the world champs like trying to source models and trying to learn
Hmm.
rules. So in that situation, like rules for armies I don't play. In that situation, I gave like 4 or 5 armies. I can't remember what the armies. I think it was like Votan, Tau, Thousand Suns, Necrons,
Hmm.
maybe Eldar. I can't remember, but it was like a limited options. And I said they
Hmm.
could pick from this set because it's these were armies I wouldn't mind playing, and also like I have the collections too.
Right.
Right.
I don't have to like either paint up, 2,000 points of an army because I'm a slow painter now. I just don't have it in me anymore. It's a
Hmm.
young man's game painting up 2,000 point army 2 weeks for an event.
Yeah.
I'm like old now. I'm just like if I want the army, it's either already painted, only needs a unit or whatever else.
Right.
Um, but yeah, so they chose Votan. So like for the world champs, I'll be playing Votan based on that similar kind of like fundraiser spiraling. But I'm pretty
Mhm.
thrilled with it. Votan's a pretty good army right now. So yeah,
Nice.
that's the
Nice.
backstory to the fundraising picking army nonsense.
That's
But
awesome.
for the vote, yeah, for the world champs at least, it was a bit more tame.
The
Yeah,
more tame. And I'm
yeah.
glad you're taking Votan. Votan in experienced hands and and capable hands is a good army. So I'm really curious to see how it'll go for you and kind of what your I mean, we won't talk about what your strategies are and your approach and that kind of thing, but
Oh,
what
we can because I mean I don't mind talking my strategies because nobody's
no.
I don't think anybody's like gunning for me at the world champs. They're not looking through the internet to, see what I'm up to. So I don't mind
If
talking and like,
if they're looking through the internet and they've come across our podcast somehow and they go through the trouble of listening to it to find out like people's strategies at the worlds,
hey, look, if
they
they want
miss
to
the
come to your
point
if
in
it
the
brings
title.
yeah, if it
It's the
Good
brings
on them.
attention to your
consolation
cast.
league.
Fair
Yeah, if
enough.
it brings attention to your cast, I'm all for
Yeah.
it. Yeah, I'll talk my
Yeah.
strategies. I don't mind.
No, well, I'm just curious because I play Votan. I struggle with
Hmm.
Votan. You and I talked a lot about Votan at the Toronto Open. Um, what is your list and kind of how are you approaching the Votan? Because I've the problem that I have with it, I feel that Votan plays kind of classic Warhammer. Like they
Yeah.
they don't really have the gotcha moments really.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And so it feels like they're very much outmatched in that way in some of the armies, like Thousand Sons, like Gene Stealers, like some of these other ones, like Tau. I struggle with Tau, with the cadre, just the up and down and everything like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
But anybody that's got rerolls and kind of answers to mortal wounds, rerolls specifically, I find like to be kind of one of these interesting mechanics in it in the game right now. Um,
Yeah, because you don't have them as
because
Votan.
we
Yeah.
don't have them. And
Yeah,
it's like,
yeah.
what the hell?
Yeah.
Like, why is it cost me a CP and you can just do this?
Yeah, right.
So I'm kind of curious, like how do you approach that? How do you approach kind of playing a quote unquote clean team versus another?
The cheaters, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The broken lists.
But it's funny you mention this because my buddy Zach Como, who was like he played Team Canada last year, and him and I have been on the same team for 10 years. We're close friends. And anyways, he's saying, Nick, you're gonna find it a bit of a what did he say? Something like you're going to find it a bit of a change or a bit of an adjustment going from Hypercrypt Necrons and Thousand Sons, my two those are my two mainstay armies, to
Mhm.
something like Votann because he plays guard, which is kind of
Yeah.
somewhat of a fair army-ish to depending on who you ask. It's they're really good right now, but still, like kind of
Yeah.
like you said, a bit of that fair mechanics army. You said you're going to find a bit of an adjustment, like. And it's true. Like I think the first 10 practice games, I got clapped, man. I lost like 10 out of 10 practice games. That's kind of my process though, too. I think it's like my thing is lose in practice, but then win at the event.
Mhm.
Fair.
And to kind of somewhat success, it doesn't always work like that. Sometimes it's lose in practice and lose at the event. Um, but I think Votann are one of those armies that when the meta isn't that hostile, like when it like you bring down the top like
Hmm.
sisters and thousand sons, they start to shine a little bit. They'll start coming out of the woodwork, and the Votann players will learn because they do play fair Warhammer, but I think they play fair Warhammer like well.
Hmm.
So as I started to learn the army and learn what I liked in the army and what I didn't like, I started to see a bit more success. And when I'm playing like I'll play against guard, against good players playing guard or blood angels or whatever, like Vanguard Marines, and I'm
Hmm.
playing like good players. And whether I win or lose, it's usually by a few points. And so
Okay.
that signaled to me like they have it. It's just, you might have to play well to get there.
Yeah.
And so, in that respect, I find Votan actually probably a very good army to learn the game. Because then if like say for yourself, you play Votan and you rep Votan for a year and you grind against Votan, and then you pick up something like Hypercrypt, you're like, oh my God, this is like cheating, And it's true. I was telling my friends, I was like, I'm finding it hard because when I played Hypercrypt, I didn't really have to care about deployment. I just made sure I didn't get tagged turn one.
Mhm.
And, I had something that could jump on an objective if I went first. But other than that, I didn't really have to like connect two brain cells together because I just could redeploy next turn, right? Like that's
Right.
easy Warhammer. Like I can't ever team turn. I played two monoliths and 20 warriors. Like that's easy when most of your army teleports every turn.
Mhm.
So approaching for Votan, like your question, well, for one, like I'm going to Worlds, so like that's a GW format. So that's very different from the WTC format.
Yeah.
And so I like that's kind of a big thing to consider. In GW format, I think the big thing that distinguishes GW and WTC is GW is it's much more vehicle permissive
Mhm.
because the way the plates are laid, like the plates I say is like the area where the terrain is on
Sure.
the map, like what they signify is like the ruins. They'll actually have areas on the ruins in the pariah pack where they say is meant to be like less than 2 inches where vehicles can actually cross over.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Whereas WTC is literally just L L L L L L L L L. Like
Mhm.
when we Scott and you and I played,
Hmm.
like you're just looking at obstacles. Your vehicles are gonna
Yep.
have to do S's. Like I'm doing the run of. I'm very good at podcasting. I'm doing all these motions in the air.
Yeah.
But essentially, it's like you're rally racing around a track
Yeah.
on WTC for vehicles. So, like, unless you have a very specific idea of where vehicles are going to go and how they're going to interact with the board, you're going to run into issues. And like
Yep.
in our game specifically, I'm playing demons, which are kind of a very cheater army too, right? Like one moment I'm there, and then the next moment they're in your backfield,
Yep.
surprise, and you're like, Jesus, like. But Votan don't get to do that. But on at least on GW terrain, it's much more permissive to vehicles. So at first I tried a bunch of different things. I tried like more Sagittar build, like heavy builds. I tried like bike heavy builds, and
Hmm.
tried like the big Thunderkin unit. And I just went through a lot of iterations to see like what I liked about the list. I didn't stick on any list at first. I just wanted to play around with pieces to see what I enjoyed. And I find Votan is like kind of flavor to your preference almost. So I landed on a list that's very similar. I played in early June, which was like, what am I gonna do here? What does like Votan do well? And I thought they do well is high toughness and armor saves. So like hecatons are toughness 12.
Hmm.
They have 16 wounds, two up armor, and they got a bunch of guns on them, right? So
Yep.
like I thought pretty good, and the GW layouts allow them to move around a bit more. Of
Okay.
course, keeping in mind that like one thing for the world champs is they don't release the mission deployment zone layouts in advance. So I have no idea if I'm playing map 2 on
Mm,
Crucible or map 7 on well, map 7 will necessarily be Hammer, but like the specific like map to deployment zone to mission
mm,
combo, we don't know in advance. So, while I think there are specific combinations that would, against a specific army, like say Tau would give me
Hmm.
trouble, I wasn't going to worry too much about that because I don't know what, and there's like so many different permutations that I could hyperfixate on playing
Yep.
Monka Tau on, map 3 on Crucible, which would, be very difficult, but I may never play that. So my approach was what is like generally good and what am I like generally trying to accomplish? And so I didn't like the Sagittar build because we're going into a meta of like sisters with castigators and
mm,
exorcists that can like exorcists can
Hmm.
snipe Sagittars from behind walls like they with the miracle dice and the triumph
mm,
like
Yep.
so I could lose two Sagittars just not even being exposed. Guard if they take demo tanks, and even like what are they called? The Lima Russell Battle Cannon Strength 10
mm.
are
Yep.
still wounding you on fairly reasonable. And then when they start stacking the AP, the Sagittars are disappearing
Yep.
relatively quickly.
Yeah.
And I found like I'm not well, nobody is. There's only one Ridvin, one Scary. There's only one man out there
Mm,
Sorry, but I'm not a very good MSU player, so I couldn't really play like five Sagittars and like, 5x5 warrior units and all this little stuff scattered everywhere very effectively. So I thought, okay, I'm just gonna go, armor, like heavy, like armor, like tough 12, and then tough 6. And I'm just gonna play something like that and play like manageable pieces for me. So I went with long way to answer your question, but I went with basically a call to lead a unit of 10 Terminators or
mm,
Hearth Guard with Volkite and Plasma Blades.
Okay.
The reason why I chose Plasma Blades is I don't put the Ignore modifier relic on that unit. I put
Okay.
the Appraising Glare. We talked about that
I
relic.
know.
And I
I'm
was bounced in and out of it too through my testing. And eventually I landed on I'm going to take it because there's going to be
it's like
those
an
matches.
auto, it's almost
Yeah.
an auto include. It really is. I missed it so
mhm.
badly.
Well, yeah, because you'll get in those matches where, there's 4 units of theirs you want to auto token, but then some other trash jumps on an objective, and you're like, oh, now I'm hitting on 4s or 5s if they have a
Yeah.
-1, and I'm like just hating my life.
Yeah.
And so I was like, there's gonna be 2 or 3 games where appraising glare is gonna be completely useless,
Yep.
but there's gonna be that one game where I'm just gonna wish I brought it. So that's what I did. So I brought, yeah, the Terminator unit with Volkite and Plasma Blades because I don't have Ignore mods, so I might as well just go for more attacks.
Okay.
3 Hecatons, 1 Sagittar with the mandatory 10-man unit of Hearthkin, so they can split. One sits at home, one goes and does
Hmm.
actions or whatever. 2x3 bikes. The 3 Hecatons, like I said, 2x3. What are they called? The dudes with the grab cannons.
The Thunderkin.
Thunderkin. Yeah, Thunder guys with the grab cannons and 2x3 bikes. 1x10 Jaegers. And 2x5 of the Berserks
Okay.
and one solo E-champ. So that's kind of more or
Okay.
less the list.
Mm,
So yeah, it's kind of like just I thought Votan good stuff, tough,
Hmm.
lots of guns, got some tricks like the bikes can scout or they can uppy downy to pick targets or do like secondaries. I put in 2x5 berserks because I didn't want to get just melee stat checked.
mhm,
Yep.
Because I played a practice day before list lock and I played against like what did I play? I played against Blood Angels and I played against Sisters, and I just didn't want to get stat checked.
Yep.
And like if I ended up going up, I didn't wasn't really expecting a lot of World Eater players, but just in case that, or I
Hmm.
was expecting a lot of Blood Angels, so if they're just going to throw Sangard and
Yep.
whatever at me, I want to make sure I had something to fight them off. So it's just a general like good stuff list where you
mhm,
got like shooting, you're kind of
Hmm.
tough, you got some melee, and I think recently in my games it's been working out. Oh, and the berserks are really good too. Like I found Votan can struggle into two up armor of contempt because all of our guns are AP one or two, or like the Sagitars are three,
Yep.
but then they don't ignore cover.
Hmm.
So the Berserks are good in the situation like um, Grey Knights, where they put Terminators on a objective and they just want to sit there and be two up armor of contempt. Well, at least the Berserks now are a threat to them. Same thing with Deathwing Knights, or like my pod has a Black Templar player with 10 Assault Terminators, so they'll be good for that.
Right.
Hmm.
And then they're also good at going into armor. I played against Sisters where, he had the typical hull spam build with three Exodus, three Castigators, and some Immolators. He went first, picked up my Sagittar, and I just pushed everything into the center. Got a little lucky, killed two Exorcists. But then now I'm having Berserks charges hulls too. So like now the
Yep.
Sisters player is like kind of forced to deal with Hecatons, forced to deal with, the odd Thunderkin unit. Anyway, so that's it. Just general, my approach was general Votan good stuff. There's not going to be any real match that I can't um I can't deal with. The
Hmm.
unfortunate thing is it's going to rely on me being a good player because I think Votan rewards player skill heavily.
It does. I would say
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, it does
Yeah.
reward player skill. Because it doesn't have tricks to get you
Yep.
out of trouble. Like
Yep.
with like I said, with Hypercrypt before, like, oops, I made a mistake. That's okay. I can redeploy my whole army. Don't have to worry about that mistake. Votan, it's like, oh, I put this in the wrong spot, and now I have a hecaton that
Yeah.
can't go where it needs to go. So
Yes.
Right.
I've completely screwed this up.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Ben Affleck meme sitting
Yeah.
outside, like just like, oh,
Yeah.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I made the mistake when I was playing some early lists where and I said it on the podcast, like I couldn't find a use for Berserks. But when I had them at the Toronto Fall Open, I learned to appreciate them again because they could get out there and they could do the damage and they could really pull through. And I was like, I was completely wrong about this unit. I wasn't using them right when I was first had them in the list. But getting them out, getting them there early, getting them onto some objectives and charging into things and using the right, like if they've got judgment tokens, using that Warrior's Pride on them. And like all of a sudden you're
They're
like
AP4. Yeah.
EP4 and they're just destroying things.
Right.
It's,
Yeah. They're a tough unit to use, especially in an army like Votan's predominantly, I would say, shooting.
mhm.
So they
Hmm.
can be tough to use because your game plan isn't always necessarily like to be like charging.
Yeah.
So that's why like I consider Votan as like a slow advance, shoot your way through, and then deal with melee threats with Berserk. So depending on the game, I'll have Berserks either both units in one Hecaton or split between two Hecatons, and then one unit of Thunderkin will come in from Strat Reserve. And I'll cover like say the middle and my natural with hecatons that have berserks, and they won't be necessarily be going out immediately. But like I played against Custodes recently, and they wanted to put the wardens in the mid ruin. I was like, that's fine. So I put a hecaton near the mid ruin with berserks. So like you want to charge out or get out towards me. Um, One, you'll have to get shot first, and then two, then
Mhm.
I can charge you with berserks, which means, for example, like in the Custodes game, they don't have one phase where they want to use their Warden Feel No Pain. There's two phases now
Hmm.
that so now you're giving them the kind of Sophie's choice for their Feel No Pain.
Right.
So yeah, the berserks can be hard to use. There are some lists, the world champs are taking 20 like 2 by 10 units of berserks. Um,
Jesus.
I think that's a little
It's a little
maybe
extreme, but
it's a little WTC. Well, it works well in WTC because there's like L's
yeah.
everywhere and it's easier to
Right.
stage. Some GW map combination. Well, that's another thing to consider, right? Like as we had said, we don't like know what the deployment zone to map combo is. Some of those maps are very open. Like there's not an
Hmm.
objective that you can sit in the middle behind a wall. So that's
Right.
another reason for my list is I've like I'll put two hecatons on an objective, and I'm like, I'm more than likely going to hold this objective for a turn or two. It's
Yep.
going to be very tough for a lot of armies to pull those two off. And if they do, I lose. But like,
Mhm.
there's not much I can do
Hmm.
about that. But yeah, so that's kind of like hedging that possibility that I end up in a situation where there's no objectives that you can hide behind a wall and sit on. So at least my army can sit in of like very tough transports and
Hmm.
Hmm.
you know,
It's
take a
its own
hit.
it's
Yeah,
its own
yeah,
blocking line of
yeah,
sight.
yeah,
A
Yeah.
nice
exactly.
little tank. So you've mentioned a couple times, and you mentioned it before we started recording, the difference between WTC and GW,
Right,
kind of layouts, terrain, how they approach, really how they approach the game.
right.
Um, how does that change? You've mentioned it a little bit there, but how does that change like your strategy, your approach to your lists, whether you're going tactical, fixed, like how you're going to play secondaries and stuff like that? We're fairly new players. I think a
Right.
lot of new players kind of get stuck
Hmm.
in that whole idea of I don't really know what the big deal is between WTC and GW layouts and how to play into them and really what that means for my game.
Right, right, right.
But they can change your game drastically just based on like some fairly simple rules. Like when we first played into a WTC, Paul and I, we were like,
Hmm.
what the hell is this? What are all these
Yep.
rules? I didn't know
Yeah.
you couldn't do this. I didn't
Yeah,
know.
yeah,
But my model can see your model. What do you mean it doesn't have line of sight?
yeah.
Yeah. I don't understand.
Yes.
Yeah, the WTC is a like a layer of rules. I wouldn't say not necessarily just on top of rules, but it is its own kind of clarification of the GW rules. And sometimes it can be inconsistent with GW because they're written at different times. Like,
Hmm.
for example, more recently we had the WTC pack, but then GW just released like say a FAQ for the WC like the World Champs.
Hmm.
Now, the WTC might have ruled something, but then not knowing where GW would go on it. So they can be a
Right.
bit inconsistent. So if you play in both, if you play in both formats, you do unfortunately have to like kind of be mindful of where they align, but where they don't align. As far as like how do you approach as a new player? So I would say terrain is a big aspect. And when you look at 40K, if you're like approaching it competitively, I would see it as the game is actually a game of three players. There's you, your opponent, and then the terrain or the format that you're playing. That's the third player that is kind of dictating
Hmm.
what the game is about. So, for example, key things that are different, like if you were to play now in WTC versus like GW format, the key things are, well, terrain. Um, Common terrain layouts in WTC, I would say, are denser in the fact that they have more kind of solid wall L's.
Hmm.
Like their plates are like 6x4, and they
Hmm.
have more of those plates with more L's. And so, whereas GW has varied sizes of plates, so the 6x4, I think there's another one that's like six or 5x3 or something, and there's a smaller one that's 4x2, and that makes, in my opinion, the board a little bit more, I don't know, creative, if you will. And
Hmm.
the L's aren't as long, they don't occupy as much space. They rely, like GW relies on the actual area of the ruin to obscure than the actual terrain itself. So when you compare both in this situation, what it means is like, well, for example, on GW, as we spoke about, it's actually a bit more permissive to vehicle movement because in WTC, when you have such a density of L's, vehicles can struggle, especially slower vehicles, to like navigate around the ruins every time they want to go somewhere. And you saw that with your hecatons, right? Like
Hmm.
it was very easy for kind of me to know where your hecatons were, like their movement was very limited.
Yep.
Hmm.
And then I could put a few models for whatever like small gap that they could get into. I could put some models there, and now your hecatons are both
Yep.
confined by my models and the ruins. Whereas GW, there are a lot of tables where there's a portion of the area of the ruin, like, I don't know, like a third of it or a quarter of it, that on in the map pack says it's less than 2 inch terrain, so your vehicles can like freely cross over it. They can't end their move in it, but they can cross over
Hmm.
it. So if you do a little bit of measurement, you're like, oh, okay, I can move 10, I can deploy here. So next turn I can cross through here, and now I'm in the mid board, right? Your hecaton can go from turn one being in your deployment zone safe to the mid board turn two, versus like in our game, I think it would have taken 3 turns or something for
Yep.
your Hecaton to run around the ruins to get and touch the center objective, unless you advance both turns. But then now your Hecaton's not shooting.
Hmm.
So that's like these are kind of the things you would think about is like, well, what does a train look like? Where is it placed? Like physically, how does the terrain land on the table? And like, how do you predict your models to interact with it? You'll notice like in a lot of WTC lists, they can be like heavier in infantry because infantry can move through walls
Hmm.
Hmm.
easily,
Yep.
whereas stuff like mounted or vehicles or whatever can't. So that starts to inform your list decisions. There's other things, for example, too, like in WTC, we talked before we started the cast. They have like the charging guide, which essentially says that you can never use models to prevent a charge based on their distance from the terrain. So what I'm speaking to here is, models have different base sizes, like 32 milliliters or 40 milliliters or whatever. Now, if I on GW, if I had a long wall and I put my models, you were going to charge me with, say, your 40 millimeter 8 bound, and I put my Hearthguard behind the wall, but like I say to you, they're now an inch from the wall.
Hmm.
Depending on when your 8 bound are, they may not be able to physically end the charge move because they can't exist in the wall,
Right.
but then they also can't cross over my models on the other side of the wall.
Right.
So it's possible in some situations, despite being like, say, 8 inches away or 7 inches away, where you would normally be able to declare and finish a charge. In this situation, you couldn't. Or, you know, sometimes the charge would actually be a 12-inch charge because your models would have to physically go around the corner of the wall to
Right.
hit the model on the other side. So in a GW format, you can actually place your models with regards to the terrain to kind of mitigate charges. And in the WTC, they don't allow that. I mean,
Hmm.
there's philosophical reasons, they don't want, what they call non-interactivity, but my opinion, it just, changes the problem from one to another. It's like
Hmm.
you don't prevent charges, but now you have basically what we call indirect melee. Like melee, you can't interact with until they're on top of you because they can be, because the walls are in WTC, the walls can be so close together that you could have, fast moving, like say Blood Angels,
Hmm.
Sandguard hiding behind one wall. I mean,
Hmm.
Sandguard are a bad example because they actually fly. So in the other situation, they could fly over. But say you had non-flying Sandguard, if that existed, or 8 bound, are exactly the same.
Yeah.
Hmm.
You had 8 bound behind a wall. Well, now they can actually from that wall charge your unit, and there's no interaction there because they're hiding behind the wall, and you can't physically wall block. So, anyways, but my personal, qualms of the WTC charge got aside, it is one example of things that can influence your game and would necessarily influence like list decisions because,
Hmm.
for example, on WTC, I don't think I would take 3 hecatons because I don't know physically where these hecatons could go.
Yeah.
Particularly, they're only like 24-inch shooting. Like
Yeah.
all of a sudden, they're like traveling a lot around a lot of ruins, and it's hard for them to converge on a point or like deliver what you're trying to deliver in a spot there. So, for example, for Votan lists, I think that's why we see a lot of the German lists end up with 2x10 berserks because those guys are infantry.
Hmm.
They can live in like the 1 hecaton the list has, and now they can like shoot out of the hecaton. You can throw 10 berserks across the field because they can go through walls or they can hide safely behind walls. So,
Right.
um,
Hmm.
I would look like if you're looking at different formats, I mean, basically the different formats right now, if you're North America, are GW, WTC, and to a lesser extent, like player placed. But yeah, spend some time looking at the maps
Hmm.
and picture like you can do it on PowerPoint or TTS actually.
Hmm.
Have you guys ever used TTS?
I've
No, I
downloaded
haven't.
it, but I've yet to actually delve into the whole building my own maps and then actually having my list and stuff
Oh,
like
so
that
there's all kinds
on them.
of mods and like
Yeah.
tools already set up for like s- once you get used to it, it's super quick to set up a table and like a GW layout, whatever, or WTC, load
Hmm.
up your models. And that's like even if you don't ever play a game, using TTS, if you just like load up the game and the map, you can see how models will interact and it'll give you just an idea. For
Hmm.
example, like practicing deployment. Now, this seems to be getting in the weeds. Like you really want to compete at this point because you're
Yeah.
like
Hmm.
you're on TTS and you're moving models around like alone in your basement. But I mean, that's kind of like any competitive endeavor, right? There's
Hmm.
prep that goes in, so that's one thing you
Right.
could prep. But yeah, that's one thing you could do is like load up TTS or do it on PowerPoint if you want, but just kind of get an idea of where models, like where you would deploy them, what your first turn would look like, right? You want to know, okay, if I deploy this here, where is it going to go? What is it going to be able to, like, what are the angles it can shoot? What
Hmm.
is it going to be able to do if my opponent comes here or there, right?
Hmm.
So I think though that would be like if somebody's new and they're really interested in getting competitive and getting better and learning a format or the difference between two formats, would be that like download the map pack. WTC is one way to do it. That's not the only way. Not WTC. TTS is one way to do it. It's not the only
Hmm.
way, but it is a great way because it's kind of out
Hmm.
after buying the TTS game, the tabletop simulator. Um, it's pretty much all the other stuff's free,
Yep.
and that kind of gets you started there.
Cool.
Yeah.
So you run the Petawawa All Is Dust tournament, and that's how you first kind of came to my attention because I heard a lot of people talk about that tournament
Amazing.
uh, and how much they loved it. People here in Kingston that have driven up and played in it, and uh, what advice would you have? Because it's a competitive 40K tournament, right?
It's wildly competitive. We had the first year we ran it, Anthony Vanella came and won it. Last year we had Matt Shuckman. We have a lot, several US guys come to play. A large proportion of like Team Canada alum or current Team Canada. Just a lot of, if you're in our kind of Quebec to what we call Toronto corridor of competitive
Hmm.
40K, a lot of the kind of familiar top players attend All Is Dust. Yeah.
Okay. So any advice for a couple of simpleton rookies like me and my brother for tackling like a high-end competitive tournament like that?
I have a buddy that's just getting back into competitive 40K too, and he's been like, we'll talk about his list, we'll talk
Hmm.
about like, his games, how they go, and like the struggle. Like sometimes he'll express from his perspective that he's not improving, and it's just like anything else. Like I used to be a competitive boxer,
Hmm.
and you can't expect to walk into a gym day one and be like, you know what? In 3 weeks, I'm going to be in the ring and I'm going to
Hmm.
start like, knocking people out. It's just,
Hmm.
I mean, there are some people that can do that. I'm sure like Mike Tyson was probably very similar, but like
Hmm.
I would say most of us mortals cannot do
Hmm.
that. And I think 40K is very similar, right? There's a whole like there's thousands of rules, trillions of rule interactions, there's hobby lag, there's all kinds of stuff. So
Yeah.
I think the first thing is setting expectations
Hmm.
is depending on the level of time and commitment you can devote, because we don't all have the same amount of time, right? Like
Yeah.
if you're a dad and you have three young kids at home, I mean, you're probably not going to be able to dedicate every evening or every day to this, right? You're going to get your one game every
Hmm.
couple of weeks and whatever you
Hmm.
could paint up, and that's the best you can do. If you're a younger single guy who doesn't have kids, that goes to university and doesn't go to class, and you practice it in the basement, in your apartment with all your friends every day, yeah, I think your ability to get better quicker is going to be much higher there. So I think like set expectations, but if you were to go to All This Dust, I think recognize that a lot of people there are just happy to play anybody. And
Okay.
especially if they're good players. If they're really good players, they're just happy to teach once the game's over. They'll be more than happy to let you know, like get you better because like a
Hmm.
rising tide floats all boats.
Hmm.
But like specifically things you can do, like download the player pack. So we
Hmm.
typically, and speaking of All's Dust, Dan and Jeremy and I run that at my two close friends. Um, download the player pack. We typically like we do publish the missions and the deployment zones in advance. So you can like if you have that information, you can start be like, okay, what is it going to look like? What are my different, you know, what army do I want to take? Do I
Hmm.
have the option of taking different armies, or are you just a one army? Like sometimes you just own one army, and that's fine too. You're like, I play Votan or I play T-Sun, so I'm going to have to
Hmm.
make whatever I have work.
Yep.
Well, look at the missions. Look at like, for example, we're doing GW terrain. So maybe Scott, immediately think, okay, well, GW terrain, my hecatons can travel a bit more freely. So maybe I'll be a bit heavier on hecatons,
Hmm.
me, lighter on other things. And then once you start to get an idea of lists, just start practicing. Practice with people that are better than you or, your skill, but just practice goes a long way.
Hmm.
Don't be afraid to try new things and make mistakes. You learn a lot from losing.
Yep.
Yeah, I think one thing a lot of players can So there's a lot of information on the internet. It's not all created equal.
Hmm.
And there's not one person, I think, or one even group, like, and I'm not here trying to, you know, like I don't denigrate like Art of War or Fireside.
Hmm.
I mean, I know the Fireside guys are super nice guys. Like they're incredibly talented players, but there is nobody, I think, on our green earth that can assimilate all this knowledge
Hmm.
and accurately like predict every interaction and everything.
Yeah.
Um, so I think if one person says something's bad,
Hmm.
well, it might be bad from their perspective with the information they have or how they understand and see the game going. But if
Hmm.
you think something is good, then give yourself the opportunity to explore that. Maybe you come out the other end saying, oh no, it's terrible. But
Right.
also maybe you come out at the other end thinking, actually, this is really good.
Hmm.
An example I'll say is like Can-Am Routine Tournament. I was floating the idea with my team running a double monolith with 20 warriors.
Hmm.
And there was a lot of, there was quite a few people that said, oh, we don't think that it's going to work. You're going to lose the monoliths. And there was it was a Storm Raven heavy meta.
Hmm.
Like they'll just get clapped by Storm Ravens and whatever else. And I played a guy from New Zealand who was running that. And we ran through the lists. And I was like, I'm really impressed. Like he was running double monoliths. I was running 20 warriors. I was like, why don't we just put this together? I think we got something here.
Hmm.
Anyways, but there were a lot of kind of, I wouldn't say haters, but detractors, like a lot of skeptics, right?
Hmm.
And I said, well, with enough practice, and I really believed in it. And when we brought it to Can-Am Team Tournament, it like the list sang. And what we realized is, yeah, Storm Ravens hit really hard. But the thing is, the monoliths, if you play it properly, will always get to hit first because I could just hide behind walls. I mean, there was a game I played last round. I played against Adam from your area. I think he plays Grey Knights right now. Marcinkowski, I think that's his last name. I can't remember. But anyways, he was playing Storm Ravens, and of course, I'm worried about him going first. Like it was player place, but we had set it up and kind of the gentleman's game, right? We both agree the
Hmm.
way I had set it up that neither of us can hit turn one, right? Like we don't have to kill ourselves measuring every single angle, whatever.
Right.
We kind of play by intent.
Right.
I went first and I'm playing Hypercrypt and I'm like, I don't want to, go first, but I have to. But even going first, I literally didn't move a model. I drew my
Hmm.
cards, look at my secondaries, discarded them, and flipped the turn. It was like a 30-second turn one. Yeah, and the reason why I was like, I don't have to go. Like I'll play this game in 4 turns, which is fine from my perspective because
Hmm.
I actually want fewer turns of you shooting me.
Hmm.
And I'll get the opportunity because the way Hypercrypt works to just put my models wherever I want, pick my
Right.
targets, and then and then get the first hit, which against Storm is very important. So, anyways, it's just a bit of an example of sometimes you can't always listen to the internet. Another actually
Hmm.
great example, Zach Como when WTC ruled at the time that tiger sharks, Tau tiger sharks,
Hmm.
once they come in, they can't act because of the size of the tiger shark. It was almost universally agreed, like across the competitive community, that they were dead. But then Zach, you know, explored beyond that and said, "Well, hold on.
Hmm.
Like, how many armies, if I rapid ingress this, are
Hmm.
actually going to be able to kill it? Like if I wrap it on my back line, who's got the guns who's going to shoot
Yeah.
across the table to kill a tiger shark? There's not a lot of armies. And then he's like, well, especially if I'm playing in WTC where I can pick matches, who's going to be able to? And like this thing has a lot of guns. And he was right. And he did reasonably well at the WTC running a tiger shark where a lot of teams thought the tiger shark was dead and there was no way it was workable. So I would say like don't be afraid to explore units that you think could be good.
Hmm.
And that would be like, there's a lot of things that goes into planning for events. But yeah, I think as new players, that's kind of the thing. Look at the missions, look at the deployment zones, consider how your army interacts with that. Try to get like a general kind of understanding of what the meta looks like, what's going to be good into the meta, what's not going to be good. And then just get some practice games and, load up Tabletop Simulator if that helps you like kind of
Hmm.
you got a half hour in the evening to mess around. You can just go on Tabletop Simulator and move your models around and see how they interact with the board.
That's
So,
great. I really like that. trying out your own ideas and working through things that, you kind of think work.
Mhm.
Because no, that's I think that's a great point
Yeah,
for
you have to be
sure.
your own advocates because when you're speaking to people, they don't always see the vision, right? You know what I said?
Mm,
Like they don't always see how the pieces play. And like if you're an expert on an army, like if you play an army a long time, like you can't expect people to be the expert on your army, right? So
Yep.
if they don't see what you're seeing, sometimes they're right. Sometimes it just doesn't work. But then also sometimes you're right. So you need
hmm
to give yourself that opportunity to be right. Yeah.
That's
That's
great.
that's kind of the thing I've seen about like if you're trying to follow lists and you're going on Goonhammer, you're going into the WTC championship list, you're going wherever you're going to find your Warhammer news. And you're looking at the list and then you try to copy those lists. It's like, well, you haven't played it, so you don't really know what the interactions are. You don't have the experience of the list behind you to know this is why this unit is in the list. And
Yeah.
you might think it's doing this one thing, but it's actually doing something different
Right.
hmm
in the interactions. That's kind of as a new player, that's where it's very easy for us to get caught in it and just be like, well, I need to find the new meta list. Oh, this is what works. Okay, I'm going to run
hmm
it, and you still get trounced because you have no idea what you're doing.
hmm
That like that skill level thing doesn't change, and having the skill level with an army is really, really important. But it brings me to another question that I had of you've mentioned meta, and I know the Toronto meta is like Space Marines. Because so what is the meta like up in the Ottawa area? Like, is it also Space Marines or is it something a little bit different? Because I know it kind of changes area to area. There's all sorts of different armies that are the meta in that area.
Yeah, the Ottawa area is interesting. I mean, we have a high proportion of, like, I would say the WTC team is classically kind of concentrated in the Ottawa area. Um, I think historically, I don't know if it's so true anymore. It used to be a chaos heavy meta. So when you go to an
Okay.
event, there are a lot of chaos players. Like that used to mean more before when chaos was mainly just a trillion books under like in one trench because you could just mix and match all the books in like seventh and eighth edition, and then ninth edition, like what we call soup armies, have become less prevalent. So saying it's a chaos meta isn't all that helpful anymore because like World Eaters and Death Guard play nothing alike.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would
Right.
say like pretty much chaos meta. I would say like meta because you often see when you go to an event like just the Red Dragon small 30-person event, a lot of the what you would think are the good armies show up. It wouldn't
hmm
be like so like say Francois or other players will bring kind of like what they think is the good army at the
Right.
time. So there isn't like I would say a very stable meta. Of course, there are some players that kind of
Hmm.
stay within roughly their wheelhouse, like Josh Crow. He plays I mean, I've seen him play other armies, but he's like Nids or Orcs. So you can pretty much predict that Zach
Right.
is Guard or Tau. I'm like 80% Thousand Sons. So uh, it's mainly the players that you're expecting when you go to these events, but I
Okay.
wouldn't say there is a specific concentration of any one thing in particular. I mean, some people might disagree with me, but I'm not entirely sure. But I think meta, like what you expect to be good is going to show up at
Okay.
Yeah.
these GTs.
The little bit of Canadian politics nerd in me kind of likes the fact that in the nation's capital, it's chaos that's prevalent.
Oh yeah. 100% chaos.
Yeah.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
utter madness.
Yeah.
Yes.
I kind of like that.
Oh,
That's really
that's
cool.
great.
So, World Championships, we've buried the lead long enough.
hmm
Congratulations on getting there.
Oh,
Like,
thanks.
what is that like? What is it like to be able to go to that? And how are you prepping for next week? I know you're taking Botan. You've talked about the
Right.
practice games and stuff like that. Um, but what is that like? Like, are you going as Nick playing for yourself? Do you go as Nick playing for Canada? Do you go as Nick playing for whatever other teams? Like, how does that work? Because I've heard different ways of approaching it. Like some people play it as they're playing, and others play it as, well, no, I'm part of a broader kind of
Right.
scope. So how does that work?
Well, the format of the World Champs is it's basically a big singles tournament, but with a kind of national lean. So like every player is playing for a specific country. So like we're playing
Hmm.
for Canada or whatever else. And throughout the tournament, the games you win contribute to a national score. And like I don't know if it's like the top five scores. It's all in the pack, but it's I know like top five or 10 scores or whatever. But basically everybody that's playing is playing their score is contributing to their like national team score. So it's different from the world team championships because you're playing in the world team championships, you're playing like it's an 8-man team and there's a whole
Right.
pairings
Right.
process and you're going in there as, but here we're all kind of just singles players, flying individually our country banner, and that like our record will contribute to the country's score. Me personally, well, this will be the second year I attend, and it's like super exciting. I loved that event last year. There is just maybe it's made up in my head too, but there is just some level of extra excitement and pageantry when you're going to like a GW proper event. Like these,
Mm.
this is where the game comes
Yeah.
from. There's these, and like the people working for GW, they're nerds and they're nerds
Yeah.
like you, but they dedicated their lives to like,
Yeah.
like their job is this. So they're
Yeah.
like, they're hooked. And it was just an amazing event to be there, see all the other like, successful players and, like get to meet some of these people that you only hear of on
Hmm.
podcasts or whatever else, play them. I mean, like for example, last year, just randomly started going to the gym with David Gaylor and we had dinner.
Cool.
It was just like a cool random thing. Or Liam Hackett, a couple of beers with him. Like these are just players that I'd been following on our side for a
Hmm.
little while because they're just very successful where they come from and they have their own kind of like podcasts, whatever else.
It's amazing.
So how I approach it is just, I play for myself, but like obviously I'm very interested in doing well for the community, particularly the community that like fundraise to like, they contributed to the food banks or it was also like children's hospitals. I mean,
That's awesome.
I didn't really care where, if you were going to donate, you could donate money anywhere. I don't really care,
Hmm.
but you donate somewhere to something good,
Hmm.
you get a vote. And yeah, I just want to kind of do right by them. Of course, it's going to be a tough field, so it's very possible I go like 0-8, but we're
Hmm.
going to do our best. The way I've been approaching it is, well, one, the army got picked, so that was fairly easy. I didn't have to like labor intensively over what army to take. That
Just
was fun.
scrutinize every night. Oh,
Yeah.
what
Yeah,
am I gonna
exactly.
do?
Well, I'm a very big spiraler too, like because I got like POW, I got Necrons, Thousand Suns, like could borrow a buddy's army, so I could be
Yeah.
like just jumping between armies nonstop. At least this gave me something to focus on. So instead of like jumping between four different armies for practice and then not really refining a list, I was able to actually just take the army and refine a list. So yeah, number one was refine a list for Votan, one that I liked. We talked about didn't really like the MSU style. I
Hmm.
didn't like the big Thunderkin brick because it was so slow.
Yeah.
And a player that realized it was coming in from Strat Reserve could just zone it out. And it being so slow, then they could just, kite it or whatever, deal with it later.
Yep.
So we designed a list. What we designed something that's a bit more mid-board pressure, just like honest, get on the points and start shooting and hope for the best Warhammer.
Hmm.
And then like just designing matchups, like play schedule a lot of practice games with friends that play different armies, like playing with Francois and his Blood Angels. I played a lot with Zach and his guard because we knew we were going to fight against guard. And
Hmm.
Zach's a bit of a weirdo. He'll play like off meta as a guard list, but it's still like he's a very at one point I think he was the top guard player in the ITC a couple of years
Oh,
ago. So
wow.
like he knows what he's
Crazy.
doing. So
Yeah.
Right.
just getting any practice into whatever list he's playing will help me familiarize with guard. And then similarly, just play with like a buddy, Kazra from out west. He played Vanguard Marine, so like just
Right.
trying to get matchups into things I'm less familiar with to kind
Hmm.
of better understand their rules, and that's yeah, that's really it. Kind of try to get familiar with. One thing we did this year that was different from last year is we played on the GW layouts. So when I say something like that, know the
Hmm.
terrain format, it's from like hard-earned experience. Because last
Right.
year,
You've still got the bruises.
oh
Yeah.
boy, do we ever. Yeah, well, last year it was like GW, and we don't play GW here, right? The format.
Right.
And so we play WTC. So we had all set up like a practice RTT, but like very intelligently the week after list submission. And so I designed all this list around like things that were working for me before on player place terrain, but not on, you
Yeah.
know, and so we do this practice tournament and the first run I'm playing it and I'm like, oh my God,
Oh shit.
I'm in trouble because I don't
Yeah.
like this list one bit. I haven't even finished this practice RTT, no, let alone the world champs. Anyway, so that was a hard lesson. We went to world champs. We had fun, but it was we were on the struggle bus last year. So
Right.
this year, yeah, we approached it a little bit different. We finally took like the train component seriously, practiced a lot on that, and yeah, that's where we ended up. So we're a few days out from going to the world champs.
Hmm.
I um I don't know if I'll be getting any more practice games. Maybe I'll try for one more tomorrow or Tuesday, but if I don't, it's not the end of the world. Sometimes
Yeah.
having a bit of a break away from it isn't a bad idea, and then
Hmm.
we'll land in
Yeah.
there and see how she goes. Yeah.
Because it's 8 games over, is it 3 days?
4 days. So it's two
Four
games per day.
days.
Yeah, 4 hour
Yeah.
games, two per day.
And no
4
clock,
hours.
right?
So they've been back and forth on the clock policy. So
Hmm.
I'm not gonna I don't really understand the clock like it's written, but I haven't really read it. But it's like
Okay.
I don't really understand the clock policy, but it is more or less you can use a clock,
Hmm.
but what they said is it's more and it's kind of like how we do it at our events. It's more for guidance.
Hmm.
If I mean they communicated this pretty clearly. If your intent is to abuse the clock and use it to your advantage, then that will get caught and you'll be penalized. So
Right.
like you can't. I mean, there'll be times where like somebody's low on time, and, like you charge their unit of 30 dudes with 60 strength one attacks, and you're like, I want you to roll all those attacks that are like we know is not going to do anything meaningful, but I'm
Yeah.
just doing this to burn your clock. It's
Right.
that type of stuff that they're going to be discouraging because from their perspective, clocks aren't actually an official component of the game. This is kind of
Right.
like
It's a
so they don't want to
tournament
roll
thing.
it in as an official, but as far as like time management, they want to learn from last year where there were some overages that were a little bit egregious. So they're
Mm.
including like time management as a specific section in the pack, and you can use a clock, and it's going to be at the judge's heavy discretion on how they manage it and whatever else. But they have quite an extensive judge team, so and like from my perspective last year, I had zero issues with time.
Hmm.
Like I could have conversations and, learn about my opponent's families and the time that
Right.
we had to play the game. You know what I mean? I had games like we had so much time in between games I could go to the gym before my
Yeah.
next game. So like
Yeah.
but I know some people ran into issues, so they did introduce this kind of I don't want to say it's vague. They did introduce some clock guidelines that will help keep things on track,
Hmm.
but it wouldn't be the traditional like death clock that some
Fair
people
enough.
might be familiar
Right.
with around in our area. Yeah.
Right. And would you ever encounter, I guess you don't encounter many like new or rookie players at these types of events, do you?
So this one potentially no, because this one's by invitation. Like it's kind of an invitational. It's something where you
Okay.
qualify.
Hmm.
So for example, I qualified this year at Can Hammer Teen Tournament. We got second, but it just so
Hmm.
happened the first team that won, most of them already had tickets because they had won
Right.
in an event previously. So we got second, so that's where I qualified. But by and large, Canada's a bit unique too. Like we have a ton of qualifying spots for
Mm.
our population. In the US, like it can be less frequent where you get more like major winners and whatever else, but more or less, the skill level there is pretty high because it is people that have succeeded one way or another at events.
Okay.
Like Goonhammer recently released an article to show like the average elo, which is like insanely high compared to even like London GT or whatever. So I've been to LVO before, and that's a good event too. My common perception, like my understanding of LVO, having been there a couple times, is your first real game could easily be like game four because you could play like three guys that are there playing, you know, Warhammer in Vegas and aren't all that concerned about the outcome.
Playing
A lot
guys
of
like
guys.
me.
Like us.
Well,
They're
like
just
it.
paid to be there and they're there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's
Wanting to play
and
some
that's okay
Warhammer.
too, right? Like we all getting whatever we want out of this hobby. Like
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
guys, want to paint their models, go throw some dice, and
Hmm.
like last year we had a guy come to all his dust, and he had the most beautiful painted death guard. He had like free-handed nurglings everywhere, like
Oh wow.
banners of like
Hmm.
skulls, and he's like a tattoo artist, so go figure his stuff is all super
Yeah.
beautiful. But
Awesome.
Like he was a less give a F guy,
Yeah.
like he could care less about the outcome. He's just there to vibe and like play with his like, that happens at LVO too, right? Because it's not an invitational event. It's just like, hey, let's put a
Gotcha.
thousand people in a
Yeah,
Warhammer tournament. And there are a ton of good players that go, but
Sure.
just by virtue of the numbers, you may only kind of start to hit them in the later rounds.
yeah.
But at like the world champs, at least more or less like round one, you're playing a guy that won a GT or a major to
Right.
get to this event. So
Yeah.
There's been a vetting process.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You
Okay.
won't see us at one anytime soon.
You
No.
never know, man. It can go by quickly. The year is a long time, There's a lot of time to learn, play the game, and
That's true.
Yeah. And so what does the event look like? Is there like a exhibitors hall and all that kind of stuff, or is it strictly just a tournament hall? People are
oh, it's
there.
it's pretty magical. So like this was only the second year,
Hmm.
but so this is in the Hyatt Regency in downtown Atlanta. So already that hotel's like a nice hotel, right? It's
Yep.
not a cheap
Yep.
hotel. You go in, and it's this like huge hotel, like I don't know if it's like 26 floors. There's this big atrium where you can see all the balconies and the floors.
Oh,
It's kind of
wow.
that typical marbled, goldy looking hotel.
Mm.
Nice restaurant to your left. There's a nice bar in front. The conference rooms are below the hotel, so you start to go down the escalators. Now they had another like education conference on the first sub level. The event was on the second sub level, and you go there and you start to go down. They also run the grand narrative at the same time. But when you got down the
Right.
escalators, you're introduced to the shop. So they basically have the Warhammer shop with all the posters, the big Terminators out there, and you're taking
Yep.
photos with it. And they have the shop that has all the knickknacks you can't get anywhere else. So now all of a
Hmm.
sudden you're spending $60 on objective markers that you don't need because you can't get them anywhere else. Like
Yeah.
I'm really bad for that.
Yeah.
Same thing with like dice and all this kind of stuff. Or you're looking for the model that might have gone out of stock elsewhere, out of print, but
Hmm.
they might have it. So they have the store, but there's also the grand narrative. So now all of a sudden you're seeing people like in heavy duty cosplay. And these people are like laser focused on the narrative, which is super exciting. And they had
Okay.
this like hologram map of like a planet. And
Hmm.
like
Oh,
there was
wow.
briefs like briefs going on of like the Imperium needs you, and there's like you're seeing I don't know, like Archmagos walking around, Sisters of Battle, Chaos, and he's just like they don't let us like competitive schlubs near them. So
Yeah.
like they're the real
They're real.
Warhammer players. Like
You're
they're the
right.
real, like we're just like accessory to,
Yeah.
like they're the real Warhammer players. And so they don't let us really near them because they don't want us to interfere with the vibe, right? The like kind of
Right.
the role play that's going on. But they do let you like before it's open or after it's closed and they're all gone, they do let you kind of if you're, polite and whatever else, walk around and see kind of their tables. And so they'll have these different rooms
Hmm.
set up where like if they're fighting on an ice planet, all the terrain is ice themed. The room is blue
That's
with blue
cool.
lights and like
Oh man.
and there's like blue skull, like blue things, and the
That's
room is
awesome.
cold. The room they crank the AC, and they'll do like if they're on like a I don't know like a desert planet, it'll be very similarly kind of like adorned, and then the room will be super hot. So
Hmm.
like they really played into the narrative component. So that's like kind of
That's
what you're
really cool. That's
yeah,
so
that is
cool.
really. I forget who I was talking to last year. I looked at them like legit. Am I going to do the grand narrative instead next year? Like
Yeah.
I think
I
they're winning.
automatically hearing you talk about it, I'm like, I think I'd rather play the grand narrative.
Legit. Like I would be surprised if I get there and Ridvin is playing in the grand narrative and you just say, you
Yeah.
know what? I don't want to do the world. I'm just going to do the narrative.
Just gonna
Yeah.
do
I'm like,
this now.
yeah. So legit, yeah. And then you get to the hall for the competitive players, and there's like three or four streamers setups.
Mm,
There's like the main judge area where they have all the swag they're handing out, and then all the tables, and there's good space at tables have all the train, and then Mike Brandt and Zach Rockner are there, and they're like kind of they do the debrief of the
hmm.
expectations, the judges, and whatever else, and like kind of how the flow will go, and they get the player pack, and all of a sudden now it's revealed what your missions are and
Cool.
whatever else, and yeah, and then you kind of start your game, and I will be honest though, like when I went, it like you can be a little bit nervous, but it starts off like any other event, right? You meet some person you haven't like if I go to Toronto, sometimes I'll meet somebody I haven't met before, and you
Right.
get over that initial like, oh, hi, my name is, and you start to get
Hmm.
into like a level of comfort. You're both there to play a cordial game, and
Hmm.
kind of that's how it went for basically 8 out of 8 games for me, and end up
Awesome.
playing some really great players, and enjoyed that quite a bit. I played actually on the Warhammer stream last year, so that was
That's
fun too.
cool.
Yeah, yeah.
That's
I
That's a
really
played
lot of
cool.
fun.
against Votan on the Warhammer stream. Yeah,
On
yeah,
their official stream.
yeah, on their official stream. Yeah, I didn't
That's
That's
win very many
nice.
fantastic.
games, but thank God I won one on the official stream.
That's all that matters, baby.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
Good
it.
job.
And so what day will the tournament start? Does it start on like Wednesday?
Thursday. So I'm flying
Oh,
out
Thursday.
Wednesday, and it starts Thursday. Yeah.
Nice. Nice. Well, I hope it's another great time and hopefully we can get you back on the podcast afterwards and so you can tell us what you were able to spy out from the grand narrative people and
Yeah,
Of course, I'll
debrief
try to
us
sneak
on
some photos. Yeah, I'll
yeah
sneak some video and stuff for you guys. Yeah, yeah.
that would
and
be
debrief
amazing.
us on how the event played out for you because it sounds really exciting. It sounds like a
Yeah.
tremendous amount of fun too.
Yeah,
No, I'll try to take a lot of photos. Yeah.
when
Yeah.
you get back, you've got a lot of interviews and a lot of other stuff to do and everything after the worlds are up. But yeah, when things calm down,
Hmm.
we'll definitely reach out and try and get you back on because it would be amazing to hear like what it was like this year and
I'd love that.
if you in fact you saw anybody deviate
Yeah, 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 exactly.
Yeah.
and go to
Half
that
of us just went to
instead.
the grand narrative, went and bought
Yeah.
costumes, just played the
Yeah,
grand narrative. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Oh man,
I
that
dressed as
sounds
a
good.
commissar and
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
just
exactly.
punched somebody and just hopped it.
You know, I,
Yeah.
I I think the reason I didn't do the grand narrative is because I think realistically, if I was in the Warhammer universe, I'd just be like a servitor or something, like,
Yeah. I think we'd all end up being servitors
yeah,
Yeah, I
just
would
like
probably.
think so.
lobotomize me and I'd just be there like scribbling something or
Yeah.
making tea or something for
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
commissary. Yeah.
Pushing a cart.
Oh
I'd be
Yeah,
just
God.
pushing a
exactly. My
cart.
life is just, or like have you played the Space Marine 2 game, where it's
Yeah.
just that guy's whole life is just lighting the candles all over the ship.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
would be our existence in the
Yeah,
grim
that would be
dark.
me. Yeah, exactly. So I don't know if I need to live that out in the grand narrative, just lighting candles everywhere all
Yeah.
weekend. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
Oh, that's
amazing.
awesome. Well, thanks very much for your time, Nick. We really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun having you on, and I really appreciate your perspective as someone who plays obviously a very high competitive
Hmm.
Warhammer as well as like organizes and helps run events locally here. It's definitely something that Scott and I love to talk about and talk to people about. So really, thank you very much for taking the time to sit down with us.
Yeah,
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. This was like a tremendous time. I had a ton of
Yeah,
fun and definitely
great.
look forward to, coming back on after the World Champs. If you want to hear about me
Oh,
wax on
definitely.
about that too. More
I
than
would
happy to do
love
that.
to hear like what worked and what didn't work for the Votan
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
we're
and
Space
what was
Dwarf
the one
fans
army
here.
that you were like, oh, for God's sakes, I did not want to fight this army and
Yeah.
it's all I fought the entire
Yeah,
time.
exactly. That's of course what's going to happen. Yeah.
Yeah, we're flying the Space Dwarf
Yeah.
banner here in this
Yeah.
podcast, that's for sure.
Yeah.
We're rooting
Yeah.
for them. So,
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you guys.
Thanks
all
very
right.
much.
Thanks very much.